Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Titika Dimitroulia, and I welcome you to our seminar on behalf of the Semiolab, the Joint Master on Semiotics, and the Απολλωνίς project of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. I'm really excited to have the opportunity today to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Astrid Erll, and I'm sure that many of you already know her very well through her books and all her amazing work in the field of memory studies, an interdisciplinary field which studies how memory shapes our cultures, our identities, and our lives. Astrid Erll is professor of Anglophone literatures and cultures at Goethe University Frankfurt and founder of the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform. She's general editor of the book series Media and Cultural Memory with Ansgar Nuning since 2004. And she has introduced some very, very interesting new concepts in the field of cultural memory. For example, the traveling memory. And together with Ann Rigney, she has published Mediation, Remediation, the Dynamics of Cultural Memory, Audiovisual Memory and the Remaking of Europe, and Cultural Memory After the Transnational Turn. Her introduction to the field of memory studies, Memory in Culture, has been translated into Spanish, Chinese, Polish, Japanese, and we really hope that we'll have the opportunity to read it in Greek soon, also her book, and then welcome her when the COVID will be over to sign, so that she signs her book. The title of her lecture is What is and to what end do we study memory as literary and media historians? We are grateful for her presence among us today in a moment where the research on memory seems to consolidate its place in the Greek-speaking research too. So without further ado, I pass the floor to Professor Erll. Thanks again for accepting our invitation to present your work to the Greek academic community, Professor Erll. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks everybody for coming. I already spoke with the colleagues in Thessaloniki, and what we said is that I would give you an overview lecture of the field of memory studies. And that's what I'll be doing today. And towards the end, I will talk a little bit about my own current research, but not in a very coherent way, which revolves around the memory of the mnemohistory of the Odyssey, of Homer's Odyssey. I will not speak longer than an hour, okay? So let's see how it goes. I'll do screen share because I brought a lot of slides.
Yes, of course.
Let's see if it works. There we are. So, hang on. Johanna, ich halte einen Vortrag. Du musst rausgehen und still sein. Okay, explaining to my daughter that I indeed am giving a lecture now. So, I think you see my slides, don't you?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So here we go. That's my question today. What is and to what end do we study memory? And when I gave you the title, that's of course a bit bold because it's a reference to Schiller's famous lecture on universal history and what the scope and the possibilities of that field could be. So being a bit intimidated by my own title choice, I read the Schiller text yesterday night again, and I found what is many things, of course, we wouldn't say like this any longer, but what I think really rings very true is what Schiller 200 years ago had to say about interdisciplinarity and about a certain type of researchers that you need to be in order to work in an interdisciplinary way. And that really means sniffing out, finding concepts in different disciplines and appropriating them in a positive way while acknowledging, of course, the others. But he says at one point, if you give something into such an interdisciplinary space like universal history, let's say memory studies, then it becomes the property of everyone of the field, and it may then be appropriated and used by psychologists, by sociologists, by historians. That's, I think, is really also the basic process of the much more modern field of memory studies. What I will do today is I'll give you an introduction to the field, and first of all, I will outline a short history of memory studies, speaking a little bit about its beginnings in the early 20th century, in the 1920s in particular. Then in the second step about the re-emergence of memory in the 1980s really. And then the more recent transcultural turn, which is also something that I have been engaged in, or the kind of work that I am doing today, transcultural memory. And here too, I will present some key thinkers to you. And then in a much shorter second step, I would like to show you a little bit about what I'm doing here day in, day out, and that is working on a book on the Odyssey and something like a long-term memory that encompasses almost 3,000 years. All right, so let's start. And what I'll present now is very much based on the two first chapters of my introductory book, Memory in Culture. When I introduce memory studies also to my master students at Frankfurt, because we have modules in memory studies integrated into our masters. And as I come from an English department, these tend to be masters in Anglophone literatures. But we do a little bit of memory studies there. And I give them a slide like this, not telling them that they need to learn it by heart or really know everything that's on there, but just to make a point. And the point is that the field of memory studies is inherently an interdisciplinary field. So memory is not owned by any one discipline. Although everyday usage of the word would of course suggest that it's probably the psychologists or the neuroscientists who have the most important ideas about memory or the leading concepts. But the way that we understand memory or collective memory is really, it's a transdisciplinary phenomenon, and there are very important sociological or historical or media studies concepts that we need to take into account. So this overview is just a fraction of what is really out there. And what I've selected is those people who have really worked with the notion of collective memory, who called it that, and who have introduced key concepts that people are working with today. So for example, you see the famous and important cultural schemata by Frederick Bartlett, the psychologist in the early 1930s. You see, of course, Maurice Halbwachs' Mémoire collective, Pierre Nora, Lieu de mémoire. And as I understand, many of you also come from semiotics, literary studies, cultural media studies. You see here intertextuality, and the more recent stuff like planetary memory or post-memory or prosthetic memory. So memory is a transdisciplinary phenomenon, and memory studies is, perhaps to be precise, a multidisciplinary field. Many different disciplines working with each other or are being in the field. Next question is, do they really work with each other? Do they really engage in interdisciplinary work? But to go one step back, before all these disciplines found together and before they could say, well, what we do is memory studies, there was a lot of research on memory, in particular the past 20, 30 years, that came under many different names. So if you started to become interested in memory, like I was in the late 1990s, you would have been confronted with words like mémoire collective, collective memory, cadres sociaux, but also mnemosyne, ars memoriae, lieu de mémoire. There is a big research field on heritage. How does that connect? Commemorative memory studies, post-memory, traumatic memory, and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of different words, and there was not really a cover term. Some people thought the cover term could be collective memory. Other people said, no, it needs to be social memory, or it needs to be cultural memory. And unfortunately, Andrew Hoskins, the sociologist, came and founded the journal Memory Studies in 2009. And ever since, we tend to call it just memory. But of course, if you talk to people who have not encountered the field yet, they will think that we mean just individual memory. But that's not the case, because we try to make a strong point that there is no such thing as purely individual memory that would only reside here. Memory does reside here, but it also resides in the body. It is connected to things around us, to landscapes, to persons around us, to archives, to all kinds of media. So this is a sense of the, perhaps some philosophers would say it's an extended mind concept of memory. So my definition of what I have long called then cultural memory is very vaguely and very broadly the interplay of present, past, and future in sociocultural contexts. And I like to keep the field as broad as possible, so that as many people and as many research traditions as possible can join the field. And for me, that's a two-step process. In the second step, we can be more definitive and say, so what are you interested in the role of digital media for collective memory? Or are you interested in the role of family and of oral conversations and so on and so forth? So, and importantly, as I just said, memory is not just a mental phenomenon, but it's biological, mental, social, and cultural at the same time. Perhaps in the language of newer research, you could also say it's something like an assemblage of all these diverse phenomena. All right, the memory studies has consolidated into an international field, in particular in the past decade. And it started with a journal that brought together research. It started with attempts to write introductions, to edit companions or handbooks of memory studies. And very importantly, Jeff Ollick and his colleagues, Vered Winitsky-Sarossi and Daniel Levy, brought out the collective memory reader. And I think that's something like a fundamental book for building the field of memory studies. And the most recent and the very important step was the founding of the Memory Studies Association in 2017. So there is now something like a World Association of Memory Studies that really tries to be not just European and North American, that really tries to reach out to other continents, because there are so many important memory researchers and memory cases there. And it is also really an association that tries to reach out to younger scholars, to give awards, to give scholarships, to make them take part in the annual conferences. So do watch out for it if you're interested in memory studies. All right, but I said I wanted to tell you the short history of the research on collective memory. And for me, that's a three-step history. And I'll quickly say something about the first phase. And that's really from the turn of the century, around 1900, up to the 1920s and the early 1930s. So memory, or a sense of collective memory, really had been had been in the air at that time. And you find these ideas kind of circulating or moving through the disciplines that were there then, or that had just newly emerged, like the discipline of sociology, very new, the discipline of psychology, very new, and they were interested in memory. So people who, or scholars or philosophers who contributed to the field of memory studies, then range all the way from philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche to Hermann Ebbinghaus, who was a empirical psychologist, Aby Warburg, famously art historian, Maurice Halbwachs, sociologist, Sigmund Freud, of course, founder of psychoanalysis. Frederick Bartlett is a very interesting psychologist, cultural psychologist perhaps. Karl Mannheim, sociologist of generations. Henri Bergson, philosopher of time. And Walter Benjamin, yeah, philosopher, writer. And these are just a few, basically, that have been important for me and that have gained fame, basically, throughout the 20th century. There were many more at that time interested in social memory, in collective memory. But I'll zoom in even further and just talk about Maurice Halbwachs for a time. Maurice Halbwachs was a sociologist who taught in the early 20th century, in the 1910s, 1920s in particular, at Strasbourg. And he was interested in all kinds of sociological questions. So he also wrote books about social classes or suicide. There's a book about suicide. But he was also interested in what he called collective memory, mémoire collective. And he devoted 3 books to the topic. And what you see here is French books and German translations. One of the funny or ironical things about the field of memory studies is that there's so much English-speaking research, but that Maurice Halbwachs' works have not been properly translated into English yet. This is something that is still in the making, and it will come out, I hope, with Oxford University Press in the next years. But we do not have the full Halbwachs, or even just these 3 books, in English yet. But as many of you come from the French department, that's of course not a problem for you. Halbwachs started out with a book that he called Les Cadres Sociaux de la Mémoire, the social frameworks of memory. And there he laid out his first ideas of what I just said, that memory is not a purely individual or a purely mental phenomenon, but there are social groups or social frameworks that shape our memories, or that sometimes even enable our memories in the first place. So this is a theory he laid out in his book, and when the book came out, he got a lot of criticism and interesting reviews, also by very famous people who were kind of interested in the concept, but not quite convinced yet. So he set out to write one more very theoretical book with case studies, and that was meant to be La Mémoire Collective. But he never finished the book because he was killed in Buchenwald in 1944. Maurice Halbwachs had a wife who was Jewish, and that was the reason why the Germans basically killed him in the end. So what we have here, La Mémoire Collective, is a not quite finished work. Before that, he brought out La Topographie Légendaire, and that's a long case study on the role that place plays for memory, or that territory or space plays for memory. Yeah, I would like to say a little bit about the Cadres Sociaux de la Mémoire, because that's really his key concept, together with, of course, the collective memory itself. English social frameworks of memory. And that's, of course, how I imagine it, to simplify what he's saying, or one thing that he's saying. And one thing is that we don't remember purely alone, but I mean, Halbwachs is a sociologist and he thinks about social formations. We remember within, or we build our memory within groups, smaller groups like the family, our friends, our colleagues, and then larger and larger groups, like religious community, nations, and other transnational formations that you may think of. And he says that, first of all, and that's perhaps the simple thing that everybody can agree on, much of our remembering takes place in social groups. So just imagine how you sit at the dinner table with your family, and then you start remembering together how your holiday 10 years ago, how that was. And that's the kind of occasions, social occasions for remembering. And these social occasions will bring certain memories in your mind, into your mind again, that you may have long forgotten. Social psychology today calls this cross-cueing. So your memories are triggered by other people who tell you, can't you remember how this and that went? And then you remember. So I think that's the thing that everybody understands from his or her personal life. The other thing is more difficult to see, and that's that Halbwachs really says there is never any individual memory. Even if you experience something all on your own, and even if you recall it all on your own afterwards, it will be socially shaped. And the example he gives is, if you go up into a dark attic room as a child, if you have that memory, so creeping up into the dark attic room, and it's not allowed to do so, so you don't tell your parents, and then you get scared in the attic room and you run down again. It's an individual experience, and it will remain an individual memory because you don't tell anybody. But Halbwachs says it will be an experience that is from the beginning socially shaped. What do you expect in attic rooms? Probably ghosts, because you were trained or you have read a certain amount of ghost stories or you've heard them. So that's the kind of social frameworks that he imagines, that kind of pre-form already our experience and then reshape the way that we remember. And there are certain strands of psychology today who have confirmed this view. For example, developmental psychology, that says that mothers train together with their children how to remember. So if you have a 2-year-old, that child will now slowly build up something like autobiographical memory. And as a mother, you unconsciously do a training with it. In the evening, you will say, what did we experience? Didn't we meet Aunt da-da-da going down the street? Didn't we have an ice cream? And so on. And so mothers help their children scaffolding their memories, and they also show them how you narrativize your memories, how you bring them in a certain order, and they also teach them what is important to remember and what is not so important. And all this is basically a socialization into a certain kind of episodic autobiographic remembering. And I think that's what Halbwachs had in mind when he said there's never anything like pure individual memory. So the circles would be one simple way of visualizing the social frameworks of memory. I think in reality they look a little bit more like this. And that would be that we are all at the intersection of many, many different social frameworks of memory. Everybody remembers with his or her family, with a certain type of friends, with the football club, with the city, with the fellow students, with a certain nation, and so on and so forth. So what is individual about collective memory? It would be that. It would be the particular way in which certain frameworks of memory intersect with me. And of course, that's not only Halbwachs's idea, or it's not only my idea, because Georg Simmel has spoken about social circles in a much similar way in the early 20th century. And then today there's of course the notion of intersectionality, and I think that would be also connectable. That would be the intersectionality of memory here. So cadre sociaux de la mémoire, this key concept, is a metaphor, and a metaphor that works pretty well in French, probably not so much in other languages, the cadres sociaux are first of all the people who surround us. These are the cadre. So people surrounding our social context. And then on a second metaphorical level, it also means the cognitive, the culture-specific schemata, I think one could say, that we retain in our minds and that we use when we experience something that we will remember later. So what is Halbwachs's legacy for today? Because his thinking is now almost 100 years old. I think it's very important that he brought to our attention the social side of individual memory in such a rigorous way that he really hammered it home and gave so many examples for it. That was really foundational, I think. Secondly, there is a legacy that I personally don't like very much, and that's pitting against each other history versus memory. I don't think that there's history versus memory, but let's hear Halbwachs first. He says, general history starts only when tradition ends and the social memory is fading or breaking up. So he sees, on the one hand, a continuous chain of collective memory, something like a family tradition or the tradition of a certain social class. And only when that has disappeared, come the historians and make history out of it. And I think this is how people who were critical probably saw history at the end of the 19th century. Think about Nietzsche also. But I don't think it is how we should see it today. First of all, we have to realize that history is what Reinhard Koselleck called a collective singular. So what do you mean with history? Do you mean academic historiography? Or do you mean the vastness, the entirety of past events? For me, memory is a cover term. Memory means the way that, the many ways that humans make sense of the past, create a sense of time. And you can do this in different modes. You can do it in the mode of academic historiography. And I fully endorse this mode. It's the one I rely on most. I would certainly rely on more on academic history than on what my grandmother tells me. But it's one mode of memory, one mode of doing memory. And then there's family memory. And then there's popular memory as we get it through the movies. And then there is probably also memory in different disciplines. Now that we are in the times of the coronavirus, we see that there is a memory about different viruses and what they did within the discipline of medical history or within virology, although nobody here among the humanities were aware of that kind of memory. So that's how I would see it today. And then importantly again, is the constructivity of memory. So memory is a construct, and I would like to read you that passage. A remembrance is in very large measure a reconstruction of the past, achieved with data borrowed from the present. A reconstruction prepared furthermore by reconstructions of earlier periods wherein past images had already been altered. I think there are three very important ideas in this quotation, which ideas that still hold today. So first of all, reconstructivity of memory. That's something that Jan and Aleida emphasize with a view to kind of historical memories. It is also what psychologists have been saying ever since the 1970s. Ulrich Neisser, for example, said that individual memory is like a dinosaur. You see bones and bits and pieces, and you kind of, these are the traces that you may have, and you piece them together and you create something very new. It's reconstructive. It's never ever something like the identical image of what has happened in the past. Second point, it is very it is shaped by the present that you are in. So we remember our history always from the present standpoint, with the present knowledge, with the present questions and concerns, and also with present normative orders that we may have in our minds. And with all this, we as a society, or remember now First World War, Second World War, with that present stance, also applies to the individual. If you remember your childhood now, you do it from your present standpoint with all the knowledge of where you have ended up so far. Yes, and the third thing that I would like to emphasize is it's not just a matter of past trace and present recall. It's not just an operation that is involves two elements, the past, the present, but it also involves everything that has been going on in between. So the memory has always a history. Certain things you have remembered already one time, two times, or 100 times. So there is always the past, the present, and the mnemo history in between. And that's what Halbwachs means when he says, what we remember now is prepared by the reconstructions that we have already done 1 year ago, 2 years ago. And whenever you have recalled that past image, and then you have re-encoded it, and by re-encoding it, you have already shaped and changed it a bit. So that's the Halbwachs part, and that was really the longest part of my talk. At least I would like to draw your attention to Aby Warburg, because he's so important, art historian, also early 20th century, who was interested in what he called the memory of images, or the social memory that he found in the way that the Renaissance took up certain symbols, again, that the ancients had already used. So you find a very different take here. Halbwachs' interest was all about social groups, and Warburg's interest is very much about media, about symbols, about certain iconic images and how they recur. And it's really, at least, or for us who are in the field of cultural studies, it's these very important two inroads into the study of memory, from the media side and from the social side, that is really important. All right, so that was kind of the first chapter of the history of memory studies, and it was the longest one. After the Second World War, the idea of collective memory did not play a great role any longer. And there have been different reasons for that. But it re-emerged, prepared in the 1970s, and then it really came out in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, you would find ideas of memory, collective memory, social memory, cultural memory, across the board of available disciplines. So you suddenly, after having been focusing on the individual alone, the individual in the laboratory, that is what psychologists have been doing the past 30, 40 years. And many of them are doing that now too. But in the 80s, suddenly they started speaking about ecologies of memory again. So how does human memory work within a context? Historians like Pierre Nora made use of the term of memory again. Sociologists, people who were interested in law, and literature and the arts, they all became somehow interested in memory. And why was that the case? I think it was a combination of many different phenomena that kind of created something like an emergent phenomenon, where people here were not yet aware that people there were also interested in memory. This is something that needed another 10, 20 years in order to bring those people together. So why? Why memory? Why was memory such an important notion in the 1980s and in the 1990s? I think the first reason is the historical transformations. of course, from a German, but also from a more transnational perspective, the generational change that occurred after the Second World War, and in particular after the Holocaust, because the witnesses of the Holocaust, it became clear in the 1980s, were getting old. It was clear that at one point they would die, and what is then lost is basically the embodied memory of the witnesses, of that first-hand witnessing. What do you need if that generation of witnesses is not there any longer? You need mediation or medial externalization. You need these people to speak to others, to write down their memoirs, to be videotaped, or whatever you can imagine. So this is really the moment that Jan and Aleida Assmann call the transition from communicative memory, with the witnesses still present, to cultural memory, which purely relies on media. So this was an important moment, and in particular in Germany you find these historians' debates, for example, in the 1980s. But it was also an important moment for, let's say, India, because the partition took place in 1947, and that means they had a similar situation, partition with enormous partition violence and millions of people dead. How would you remember that in two states, India and Pakistan, who had not really remembered it so far? And the witnesses were also now slowly getting older. So you find these similar configurations about historical happenings around 1940, 1950 that you find in the 1980s. And then, of course, many political transformations, end of the Cold War, end of apartheid, sorry for the typo I see, aftermath of diverse dictatorships in Latin America, from Argentina to Chile to Colombia, and the way, the attempt to address these difficult pasts, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that were launched in order to deal with those difficult and violent pasts. This was really what the 80s and 90s, I think, were preoccupied with. And then there were new developments in media culture. Digitalization means something completely new for the archive in terms of access, in terms of sheer numbers of information items that can be retained. So digitization, but also mass media and social media, and in the way they represent histories. So the representation of histories for mass audiences, that also got great traction in the 1980s and 1990s. I leave it there, and I just show or introduce to you the key players in the field as it was in the 1980s, 1990s. There is, of course, first of all, Pierre Nora, the French historian, who kind of also belongs to the Annales school, who, and that's something that the context was also Halbwachs's context, coming from Durkheim, talking a lot to people like Marc Bloch and Charles Blondel. So there was a group of French historians and interdisciplinary scholars in the 1920s, where collective memory was an idea, not the most important one, but was an idea. And then 50, 60 years later, it was kind of taken up by Pierre Nora, who also belongs to this French schools of historians. And he brought into the discussion the important concept of lieu de mémoire, the site or the location of memory. And he uses the term in a very broad, metaphorical way. So what we could all imagine he means with that certain particular sites or buildings like the Arc de Triomphe or the Louvre, but he also extends the notion, and a site of memory for the French nation can also be La Marseillaise, so a musical piece. It can be a novel, it can be literature. It can even be certain ways of speaking. All these are examples of sites of memory for the French nation as Pierre Nora brought them together in 3 volumes. So it's like this, the sites of memory. And what he basically says is that again, like Halbwachs, that the natural memory has kind of broken up in modern society, and what remains are these sites of memory that where certain ideas of the past kind of crystallize and that are used by people who belong to a nation in order to remember the nation and in order to have a sense of collective identity. What was really important about Pierre Nora is that it was such a generative concept. So it was really something that people understood almost intuitively and could transfer to their own contexts. First of all, there were national contexts. So we have here sites of memory in Italy, or sites of memory in American literatures and cultures. We have German sites of memory, or we have then German-Polish sites of memory. There are numerous book projects which try to kind of gather the sites of the interesting sites of memory of anything, also probably a region or just a city. The problem that Pierre Nora brought to the field is what Ulrich Beck would have called methodological nationalism. So Pierre Nora thinks in the framework of the nation. And that's something that Halbwachs never did. He wrote about the collective memories of everything, really, but never of the nation. But that's something that Pierre Nora brought in, and it was readily taken up. And what this occludes is that memory does not make halt, does not stop at national borders, but that there are many memories that are shared between nations, memories that transcend nations from the very beginning. So that was part of the critique when it came to Pierre Nora's concept. And I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about the transcultural turn, because that's something that many scholars realize, that we cannot go on doing memory studies as if it was only national memory studies. The nation is an important frame, but it's not everything. But before I come to that, let me quickly introduce to you the most important memory scholars from Germany, and that's Jan and Aleida Assmann. You see here their first and most important books, and since that they have published numerous books, but in these 2 books, some of their basic theory was really articulated. And you see here, I think that's also interesting, how long it took for those books to be translated into English. And that means you have a very asymmetrical discourse internationally. Germans spoke about memory in one way and Americans in another way, or they may have reinvented the wheel, and then until Jan and Aleida Assmann became accessible, it took 20 years. So that's interesting in terms of the history of the field. So Jan and Aleida Assmann, in a nutshell, is what they call cultural memory, is not all of collective memory, but a very particular important part of it. And sometimes they would call it the canon in a broad sense, or foundational memory. What they mean is those foundational histories from which we basically gather or take our values and norms, from which we take a sense of identity, collective identity, national identity. So where do we come from? Identities. And what should we do? Values and norms. And Jan Assmann famously compares different ancient cultures according to their collective memories and claims, as so many others, and I guess that's also the history, that Homer, for example, the Homeric epics had been formative for ancient Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries, as that was a cultural memory, something to remember, to study, to read, to perform, and to draw your key stories, your identity, your values and norms from. Importantly, they also say whatever a society remembers has a political dimension, and it can go two ways. You legitimize, saying as the old already did, so do we today, or you delegitimize, and that's the contra-presentic dynamic, saying let's remember again how the old did it and see how much we have deviated from that, and we should go back to the old ways. So you can do different political things with memory, of course. I will not go much more into this. Jan and Assmann distinguish between two frames of memory: short-term, long-term. Communicative memory, 80 to 100 years, oral communication with the witnesses, cultural memory, the medialized stuff from Egyptian pyramids to writing, printing, and whatever. And the cultural memory is potentially the super long-term memory that can stay alive for 3,000 years or more. So that would be their comparison, but I'll not go into that. But I will go on with Jeff Ollick, who is an American sociologist and who entered and observed the field of memory studies as it had not yet been constituted in the 1990s. And he kind of compared what people did when they said they were working on collective memory. And they looked at what psychologists and sociologists did and what historians did and so on and so forth. And he said, basically what we're dealing with is two cultures. There are people who say collective memory, but what they mean is collected memory. So these are the psychologists who say our memory in the mind has this collected aspect. It collects information, it collects certain schemata, it may probably collect certain triggers or cues that it finds in the objects around it. So that would be collected memory, the individual side of collective memory. And then he says there are these sociologists and historians who work on collective memory in the narrower sense. And they are interested in how institutions, in how archives and so on, in how they create a version of the past. And I think that remains a distinction that we should keep in mind heuristically, while acknowledging that it's actually one process. And between these far sides of the process, there is much traffic, or they need to interact in order to make collective memory. So there's an individual level, and there's a social and a media level. But the individual needs to actualize the mediatized memories. For example, you need to read an historical novel in order to make what is in their collective memory. If nobody reads it, it's not collective memory. So you always need individual minds. There's no collective memory out there in the monuments and in the archives if there are no individual minds to actualize it. And it's also the other way around. As Halbwachs said, the individual mind and the way even it remembers even its most personal experiences will be shaped by this social and media level. So to put it simply, what we're dealing with in the field of memory studies is a range that encompasses individual remembering in a sociocultural context, all the way to the social construction of shared pasts by means of symbols, media, and institutions. And that would be a community's memory, usually people would say in a more metaphorical sense. And what this model implies is that there are different dimensions of memory that kind of interact, or that interact in order to make memory emerge, a material, a social, and a mental dimension. So basically Jeff Ollick, what he did is he kind of sorted out memory studies. And there's one more person from the new memory studies whom I'd like to introduce, and that's Ann Rigney, because she really put the dynamics of memory on the agenda of memory studies. She reminded us of the fact that memory is constantly in the making, is constantly in the works. As I said, a monument that's out there is not memory. A monument becomes only memory when people engage with it, when people create a ritual, perform a ritual in front of it, when people tear it down and rebuild it. So memory, in order to stay alive, needs to be constantly invested again and again. So that's the basic idea by Ann Rigney, the dynamics of memory. And one way for this dynamics is then remediation. So the most important memory sites that you can imagine could be whatever, anything from the French Revolution to wars or terror. What you will find is that they are constantly remediated. It's not as if there was just one book or one film or one letter about the event, but in order to become collective and stay of interest for each new generation, you will have to put it again in different media. Usually from the personal letters to the newspaper articles, to probably novels, screenplays, theater performances, the digital world, and so on. So memory is constantly remediated. So this dynamics perspective is, for me, a very important building block for the next step that memory studies took, and that's the transcultural turn. So let's keep in mind the dynamics of memory. But if we go back now to the more traditional, in many ways unthinking forms of doing memory studies, like charting the sites of memory of, I don't know, southern Germany, for example, what these people thought or kind of seemed to have imagined is that there's something like cultural memory, like in a box. And then you have similar boxes that all fit neatly on that. So cultural memory seems to equal somehow more or less the nation, seems to equal more or less a certain geographical space, equals one ethnicity, is the same as one religion, fits in the same container as one language. And of course, all this then creates one collective identity. And this is decidedly not how culture works, and it's also not how memory works. And in order to address this, that memory is out of bounds, spills over, is constituted by different communities coming together or moves across different communities. Different scholars have used different terms. So some spoke of, and that happened around 2010, that people thought, okay, what we're studying out there is very rarely that kind of contained, pristine memory. But you see that some of the resources of memory came from somewhere else, or that you have all kinds of shared histories of violence that are transcultural from the very beginning. And then people came up with these different terms like transnational, transcultural, traveling memory, multidirectional memory. And they all have a different nuance, a certain accentuation. But I think the thrust is similar. I click through this in order to show you what, for me, were the protagonists of this transcultural turn in memory studies. Importantly and early, the sociologists Nathan Schneider and Daniel Levy on the Holocaust in the global age, who studied the Holocaust as a cosmopolitan event and a cosmopolitan memory. Then for me as a literary and film scholar, Prosthetic Memory by Alison Landsberg became very important. And she asks, how is it that certain films about American history that are produced in Hollywood probably find viewers across the globe, and what do they do with it? And she says they take on these memories like a limb. That's why she uses the strange metaphor of prosthetic memory. And what does this do? Alison Landsberg is very positive and optimistic here. She says it's a resource for empathy and for solidarity. It may not always be the case, but I think it does happen, and there is the phenomenon of prosthetic memory. Then importantly for the discourse on the connection of Holocaust memory and post-colonial memories is Michael Rothberg's multidirectional memory. Marianne Hirsch is also very important. She first looked at the transmission of memories, traumatic memories across generations, second generation Holocaust memories. And then she extended that and says there's something like connective memories that connect certain generations that have been witnesses or secondary witnesses to violence. So there she also had basically made a transcultural turn. And then there were more programmatic books about transcultural and transnational memory. There's Steph Krapps and his colleagues on Memory Unbound. And then there was a big research network for 4 years funded by the EU, also with people from Greece and I don't know, 20 other languages. And we all worked on how does transcultural memory happen in Europe, and does it happen, or is it much more national what we find than what hopeful people might have suggested? Yeah, newest book by Michael Rothberg, The Implicated Subject, and I think that's another important intervention into this thinking of transcultural memory. My own contribution was traveling memory, and I know that the metaphor might suggest leisurely travel, but what I mean, of course, is something like memory on the move, memory that does not stand still, but memory that moves from community to community, for example. And I think coming from cultural studies, and as many of you do from cultural semiotics, it's the basic cultural process. Even if people don't want to hear it and don't believe it, and even if it doesn't play a role, I do think that everything we use, our language, our religion, our memory, comes from somewhere else or has influences, of course, from somewhere else. Nothing was just made and created in one spot and stayed there neatly for the past 2000 years. So that, in a sense, the traveling memory is a truism for me. But I think it's a good term if you again say it broadly and then look again at the different categories. And 5 I suggested, there may be more. We could study how carriers of memory travel. So what about these travelers, merchants, soldiers, migrants, diasporas? What kinds of memories do they bring into their new contexts? How do these memories from elsewhere connect with the memories in the new space? Then, of course, importantly, media are or create traveling memory. Ann Rigney has called the book a portable monument. And then there are the important practices of translation, adaptation, all kinds of remediation, really, that create or make memory be on the move. There's a globalizing film industry, there's transnational television, there are digital media. All these are media of traveling memory. What travels is, of course, with the media, certain contents, for example, important stories. What also travels are practices. Look at how far the 2-minute silence, for example, has traveled as a commemorative practice, and there may be many more. And certain forms travel as well. So, for example, the historical novel or the epic is a form of encoding a certain memory of the nation. That has traveled as well, been used elsewhere for mnemonic purposes. So, and for the last 5 minutes, I will come to my own project. As I said so far, I've basically given you an overview of how the field has developed and what it's doing now. And it's doing many other things. This was just my perspective For example, there's very important work on climate change, on memory, Anthropocene and memory, planetary memory. There's a lot of research on memory activism, for example. Still human rights very much on the agenda. So it's a big field, and this was just my particular way through it. What I'm working on now, and in the end of the day, that's the second part to the traveling memory article, because when I thought about traveling memory, of course, I had in mind the research that people like Nathan Schneider had done on the Holocaust. But being a literary scholar, I was really interested in traveling stories. And being somebody who teaches English literature, I have taught year after year and year after year James Joyce's Ulysses. And as somebody who also works in a post-colonial studies department, I have also taught again and again Derek Walcott's Homeros and other Caribbean stuff that goes back to the Odyssey. So basically, I came to the Odyssey as an example of traveling and transcultural memory by reading backwards, by looking at remediations of the 20th century and wondering why on earth do they still use that narrative pattern, and what are the processes that have been taken place in between, so that after 2000 years that narrative pattern is still available. And that brought me on a, ironic as it may be, but yeah, sometimes life is ironic, on my own Odyssey that is now almost 10 years old. And that had to do with looking at how the Odyssey was created in ancient times, how it traveled, how it was almost forgotten, at least the Homeric version in the Middle Ages, which also says memory is not just flowing. 99% of the stuff out there is just forgotten, it perishes. So what is needed for certain memories to survive and to be reinvested with meaning by so many new generations? So this is basically the kind of stuff I'm working with, and you see a lot of English and German speaking stuff. So in terms of a mnemo history of the Odyssey, it is very much based on the cultures and languages I work with. There you could do so many more and other things. Why I find that the Odyssey is so interesting for memory studies is you find almost all aspects of memory are connected with the transmission of that story, or of that narrative even. And then you find, if you look at academic history, that the fundaments of memory studies were often laid with a view to Homer. If you think about Milman Parry and his idea of the oral epic and how that works, I mean, the difference between oral and literary memory are one basis of memory studies. And from there we went on. So what's the difference between literary and audiovisual memory? What's the difference between audiovisual and digital memory? But this basic idea has interestingly been developed with a view to the Homeric epics. So you find some of the dimensions that you can address with the Odyssey and the Iliad, of course, as well. The typical cultural memory that comes from Assmann's, the question of canonization. It's a great example for studying memory across the longue durée, because there has not been a lot of work on that really. Most people tend to focus on events of the 20th century and how they are commemorated today. There is not some, or they look at one event, let's say in the Middle Ages, and how it is commemorated today. But to look at the mnemo history, there's not much existent work on that. It's a transcultural memory, it's super transcultural, it's really memory almost virtually across the globe today. It has these media memory dimensions that I've spoken about. It has interesting relations to individual memory, because the ancient bard would of course have known it by heart or had kind of the memory of the epic in his mind and he would have performed it like that. So something that München has famously called the resources of memory. But then there are other individual memories, and there are readers' memories. What do we remember of such a long text like the Odyssey when we've read it? And what then becomes formative for the book that we may want to write? Narrative schemata, cultural schemata, very importantly. I feel there's a lot intergenerational transmission stuff. Also, if you think at how the Germans kind of adopted Homer as their writer and how one generation of scholars kind of passed it on to the next generation of scholars is interesting. I found in personal exchange, also after lectures I gave, that there's somehow a very effective family memory component to these classical texts. And I think affects and emotions in general are very important if we want to understand what this old stuff makes here today. And you hear on the right-hand side, you see a few examples of what the old stuff does here today. And on bottom right, you see a Chinese vase in the Ming style, which is created by Ai Weiwei, who kind of illustrates, it's 2 or 3 years old, refugees, of course, across the Mediterranean, and kind of fuses ancient Greek epic with classical Chinese workmanship, transcultural memory, of course. I leave it at that, and because I don't want to go on too long, and perhaps whatever else I brought, I could also say in the discussion. So thank you, everybody.
So, Professor Erll, dear Astrid, on behalf of everyone here today, thank you very, very much for your enlightening overview of the field of memory studies and of the presentation of your inspiring, recent proper work. I think it is time to have some questions. If someone wants to ask something or to comment on the presentation. Ναι, κυρία Ιωαννίδου.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk and the organization of the gathering. It's a great pleasure to meet you because I'm actually conducting some research in the seminar of Mr. Pangalos about memory, trauma, and mental lexicon. So I'm thrilled to ask you some questions. I read about the difference between collected and collective memory. And if understanding correctly, collected memory is part of the individual one. So can collectives or social groups also have a collected memory? And does this also apply to trauma? And then, I mean, have you ever considered how the collective memory or a collective trauma manifests itself in our language use and mental lexicon, maybe?
Thank you so much. Now, let me quickly check. You're speaking about drama and not trauma, just drama.
I'm trying to say trauma.
Trauma, okay, sorry. No, my listening comprehension is really bad, so it's trauma. Okay, you know, the question, basically, I think your question is this collected, or do collectivities have a memory? No? Should we say that? And I think that's contested in memory studies. If you look at people, and that may be interesting for you, like Jeffrey Alexander, who has written books about cultural trauma, he would say, yes, I use the notion of trauma for a certain nation. The Swedish were traumatized by a certain terrorist attack, he would say. But then he's a social constructivist, and he is very neat there and says there is individual mind, mental, bodily trauma even, and then there's a cut. And then I call trauma of the social group, I call it trauma, but it's something that obeys a completely different logic. The trauma of a social group needs to be constructed. It's very social constructivism. It needs to be mediatized. So you need to hear in the news about it. You need to watch a film about it. And then a community, people in a community may have a sense that something has happened to their community that breaks it apart. And he calls it a cut in the social tissue of a collectivity. And then that's for him a cultural trauma. So I guess he would use the term memory and trauma for collectivities, but he would say the logic on that level is completely different from the logic that we might have in our mind and our bodies. I myself would say, yes, we have to be very careful. What I do not want is thinking in simple analogies. No? So the human person has a trauma and she may repress something and then it returns. And that's something that Wolf Kannsteiner has said. Nation states can repress stuff and it doesn't return sometimes. They can repress stuff with impunity. And I think on the one hand, we need to understand the logic that works on different levels of what we study. And on the other hand, I do think there is not such a cut, but that things are connected. If you look at Argentina or at Latin America, they have a very strong discourse on how traumatized people, traumatized by dictatorships, by being disappeared or being raped or whatever happened, how many people have traumata, how they communicate about traumata, and how from there emerges something that they would call a cultural trauma. What I would say is I tend to look very closely at the level I'm working at. It's the individual, it's the group, it's the nation. But I think there are ways of translating from one level to the next and that the levels are connected. Very abstract, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Is there any other question for Professor Erll or comment? Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
How did you come to the field? How did you enter the field of memory studies? How did you approach the notion and then the study of memory?
Yeah, I'm one of the few who was academically born into the field. So when I was at university, there were already memory studies. And the reason is I studied at a very small university, at Gießen University in Germany, and I was going to become a teacher of German and English. And then that small university got a huge amount of money in order to install a research center, which they called Memory Cultures, and that was in the late 90s. And this Memory Cultures Research Center tried to work with theories by Nora and Assmann from a strong interdisciplinary vantage point. So from the beginning, there were politologists, sociologists, ancient historians, archaeologists, art historians, literary studies. So my first impression of what academia was a very interdisciplinary group of memory scholars. And having said that, of course, I have a training in literary studies, which in Germany and probably also elsewhere turned cultural in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, it became very clear that you cannot just be a philologist who edits the umpteenth version of Shakespeare's work, but that we wanted to say a bit more about social, cultural phenomena. And this is why whoever did literary studies in the 90s, as I did it, you would immediately, naturally also read important anthropological or sociological works. And you would think about how the literary texts are connected to cultural ways of narrating something, narrating past, narrating gender, narrating identity. So I had from the very beginning the idea that literature contributes something to culture and is shaped by culture. And I think I can translate that easily and immediately into memory then. Literature creates collective memory, literature is shaped by collective memory.
Thank you for sharing these memories of your entering in the field. Ο κύριος Γκοτινάκος.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I don't know if you can see me, I just opened the camera.
Yes.
So at the beginning, we talked a little bit about how memory is formed and how this is an interdisciplinary field. So I imagine that from the very operations of the neurons to then conceptualizing the mental processes, there's a whole chain of concepts that gets nested one to another. But what is the driver, the core driver behind it? Maybe there are more according to different theories. And how determinative do they think that they are in this process? I mean, can somebody actively change how he forms his memories? Or is it purely cultural, historical formed thing? Something like that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for reminding me and everyone in the discussion also about the neuronal fundaments, really. There is a lot of research in neurosciences and very little attempts at looking at more contextual, social, even cultural aspects. I think they just aren't there yet, but some are. And for example, what's his name again? Bad with names, so I forget that. If I look at what colleagues from the neurosciences show as models of memory, then you find 5 different levels just on the neuronal categories, just on the neuronal level. So basic encoding, this and that, this and that, this and that. And then they only slowly start to think about what a context could contribute to this. I am more familiar and comfortable with cognitive psychology categories. And let me perhaps say something about that. When cultural studies people and historians talk about memory, what they say is usually modeled according to the episodic autobiographic memory. So the memory that Endel Talving has called the mental time travel, memories about your own experiences. That's the basic model. And that's what they call memory. And then that's where they draw their analogies, no? Like our own autobiographical memory kind of is very important for a sense of identity. They say cultural remembering creates collective identity. Of course, in the individual mind, there are many more systems of memory. There is the semantic memory, knowledge retention, and there are also implicit forms of memory, such as habitual memory or priming. And I think that they are all importantly involved in the memory process and that they have all cultural dimensions. And I'm not quite sure if I understood your question about the driver correctly, but perhaps a question of what would be a key process that we find on the different levels that we study. One suggestion would be, yeah. Or do.
What I meant was that if we look at the causal chain of how a memory is formed, at what point does the factor of context enter? So if it's at the beginning, then we have no other chance. If there's a mental process, a cognitive process that we can influence, maybe by being cognizant about it, then we could have some level of control. That's what I was hoping for.
Okay. So the neuroscientist citing, and I put it in the chat, that's Yadin Dudai. If you look at his model, he has these 5 categories of certain neuronal processes which become more and more complex, and then he starts thinking about context. So he's one of the few who also thinks about contextual cultural features. I would say with Maurice Halbwachs, the contextual is there from the very beginning. There is the plasticity of the brain, and when it develops with the child into something that can retain experience as memory, it is already in a social context. So for me, it's from the beginning there. We have a social brain from the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ο κύριος Καπαραλιώτης.
Yes. Hello. So I would like to thank you about your interesting presentation. I would like to ask, you showed that the collective memory is shared on individual and social media memory. And the connection between them is that the individual memory shapes the social media, and the social media actualizes the individual. Why the connection is like that? Why the connection is not opposite?
I meant it opposite, and I hope that I did not mess up my model and it points into the wrong directions. It's exactly opposite as you suggest. The individual memory is shaped by media and by social contexts. That's the one thing. And the other way of the traffic is media representations need to be actualized in the individual mind, or they are not memory relevant, not collective memory relevant. Agreed?
Εντάξει, κύριε Καπαραλιώτη. Μας ακούτε?
Ναι.
Μας ακούτε, ακούσατε?
Ναι, όλα και. Ναι.
Ωραία. Εντάξει, έχετε τελειώσει?
Ναι, εντάξει.
Okay, thank you very much. Ο κύριος Σπυριδονίδης.
Hello, thank you very much. I would like to ask if there is any kind of direct quantitative relation between travel literature and collective memory, as you mentioned, Ulysses, Odysseus, Odyssey. If there is any kind of relation, quantitative relation that has to do with reception, maybe, I don't know.
Okay, so you mean travel literature as a genre? And its relation to collective memory? Okay. There are some research projects on that. One is Nadia Butt from Gießen University, who looks at travel literature between East and West throughout the past 200 years, and also how they created something like transcultural memory. I'm not sure what you mean by the quantitative. If quantitative methods are used in order to see what literature does for collective memory?
Yes, I was thinking some travel literature texts that are not very known. So some rare texts that are not very diffused. So has this kind of collective memory has to do with the diffusion of a text in a certain language, in a certain cultural framework.
Exactly, that's the important thing. It's the question is the diffusion. No?
Mm-hmm.
So quantitatively, what I tend to do, look at print rates. So how often was it printed? Where would you find it? That's important for the Odyssey project. Sometimes in order to understand what are certain nodes in the process, the books that rewrite the Odyssey and that have enormous print runs and are translated into all languages, and then they are key players. Sometimes they are hidden. James Joyce, for example, draws for his Ulysses heavily on a children's version, on Charles Lamb's The Adventures of Ulysses. This is something that is not very often or not loudly enough said. The children's version, that was the node in collective memory. That is something that spread the story across the 19th century, and particularly across the young people. I think textbooks that you have at school and children's literature just cannot be overestimated when it comes to these first formations of ideas of the past.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of, I haven't done it, but I think we could do much more with digital humanities tools in order to see how topic modeling or whatever, how certain phrases, ideas crop up again and again.
I was thinking, for example, the indirect presence of Odysseus, of Ulysses, in Divine Comedy, for example. It is an indirect presence that passes in the Italian collective memory, for example. This is what I was thinking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Kyrios Kitsios.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for this wonderful presentation. I was always mesmerized by the study of memory at the psychological level, but I'd never expected that we can also study it to the cultural one. So I have 3 short questions for you. The first one is this: to what extent does the collective memory imposes on the construction of the individual one? And in other words, can we manipulate or filter the perceptions of memory actually received?
So, can you say it again, the last part, the question?
Can we, in one way or another, manipulate or filter the perception of memory, of collective memory received?
Yeah, I think what has been done is studies by cognitive psychologists that had kind of focus groups in the lab, and they observed how collective memory is formed and how individual memories are shaped and sometimes also distorted by the way that a social group talks about a past event. So in a sense, it seems what we try to do is we try to make our personal memories cohere with what the others say. And if the others say loud enough and clear enough that it was this way, our memory tends to move this way as well. So there's some psychological research on that. Yeah.
Thank you. So the second question is this: if the fragmentation of memory inferred is a modern realization, what can we expect from now on in a postmodern context and in a postmodern level?
Well, that's of course the big question. I think fragmentation of memory, first of all, is of course a result of the fact that there's more that's being retained and more that can be remembered. And that's a good thing, because there are also now in our modern age other versions that can be remembered than just a dominant strain. I think the fragmentation of memory, if I would study it today, I would study it with social media and what they do, because all the models I had in my mind about the mediatization of memory were based on mass media and the fact that there is something like a cultural elite that disseminates versions about the past via the mass media. So I have worked a lot on national cinema or Hollywood and its dissemination of images of the past, or of this classical news photography, no? And how certain images of Vietnam and so on were thus disseminated worldwide. And now with social media and the fact that there are so many subgroups who follow their own interests and their own conversations, I think that public sphere is indeed fragmented. And I think there is a new logic of collective memory. Andrew Hoskins calls it the memory of the multitude. And then there are certain things that seem to run through all these new collectivities, like memes, for example. So there seem to be certain iconic images, for example, that still have almost global traction, but probably not the meaning that is assigned to them. That may be within the social media groups, very particular. So you see, I'm groping. I don't know.
Thank you. And a last question, which is also prophetic, let's say, question. What are your thoughts on memory's contribution during the pandemic? Do you believe that we will draw on it in order to like reconcile our living trauma and drama?
Yeah, you know, I've thought quite a lot about the coronavirus in the past year and what it does to collective memory. And I think my answer to the question of whether Corona will be remembered, the answer is, does this phase change something? If after 2 years we go back to normal and nothing has changed, then I think it will not be a very memorable event. Because memorable events are events that have brought about a change, so that you can say there's a world before and after the Second World War, before and after 9/11 and so on. And because of that reason, that it's bad, but not much changes, the main pandemics of the 20th century have not been remembered. They have not really become a big part of collective memory. But so having said that, I think because it's such a long event, I mean, it's an epoch for if you are young, it's really, really long. It's now, my students are in their 3rd semester online. And I think it's a generation shaping event, and globally. So I think if those who are 20 now, if they meet anybody in 50 years from any part of the globe, they will be able to say, you remember Corona times, because everybody in some sense had that. But I'm not sure if it will then travel across the generations. I'm not sure if it is something that we will tell our children as the most important stuff. I'm not sure it is something that people in 100 years will remember. Also because I'm not sure now what the message could be. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ο κύριος Γραβάνης.
Good evening. My question is, I write it down. Could you believe that an artistic representation, painting, a book, could be a trustworthy version of the collective memory of the history? As, for example, the biography, autobiography, the documentary.
Yeah, thank you.
Because the artist is very subjective.
Yeah, but so is the autobiography and the testimony. And to a degree, also the documentary. I think there are 2 questions that you just posed orally in the chat. There's just one. Is it an adequate representation of history, of the past events? And I would say nothing is. Or we approach an adequate representation of the past events if we bring together a host of sources from many different perspectives. That's my take on authenticity or the reality behind all that. But I think the much more interesting question for us scholars of culture is probably what you wrote, and that is, can art be an adequate or trustworthy representation of collective memory? Can it be a representation of what's in the mind of people, how people see a certain past? And I would definitely say yes. I would definitely say yes. Also because that has been much of my PhD work and so on. I studied novels about the First World War that came out in the late 1920s. So All Quiet on the Western Front, for example, is the one that people most remember. And I think they are something like a clue to what people remembered, wanted to remember, what are the stories of the past that are that people agree upon. And then again, the quantitative question. If these novels have enormous print runs, and if they are spoken about in a certain way in the newspapers, I think they are a good indicator about what is in collective memory. And in certain ways, I think even abstract art can do that, but then you need the art history specialists who tell us how, yeah. And with what meaning.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see Calliope's question in the chat. And there again, how could the medialization of memory affect the authenticity of cultural memory? And the question is, are we talking about the authenticity of the representation of the past? Difficult. Or are we talking about the authenticity of the representation of cultural memory? And then it would be authentic if it manages to represent what people think at this very moment about the past, in their very location right now. How do we think about the Holocaust after 9/11? How do we think about the Cold War after the fall of the Berlin Wall? That would be the kind of authenticity which is different in each new different context, every year different, with every generation different.
Κυρία Ιωαννίδου.
Thank you very much.
I'm really sorry for overtiring you. There are 3 points that shape my last question. I promise it's the last one. First of all, you talked about the mediation of literature, of memory, I'm sorry. Then there is your paper, literature as a medium of cultural memory. And then there's the discussion around Biden's inauguration poem and its translation. So if the translator themselves affect the piece of literature they're translating, then who has the right, let's say, to translate a piece that affects collective and cultural memory?
Okay.
And what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I think the entire translation question is probably something that you know much better than I do. What I can say from memory studies is that something that has not been acknowledged is that translation, also the very simple interlingual translation, from German to English and from English to Chinese, is such an important player in everything that we call traveling transcultural or global memory, because much of what we remember is coded in words somehow, and then you need the interlingual translation, or you need the dubbing of documentary films and so on. And that translation means, of course, already translation, means a certain localization, means a reshaping of meaning, which is taking place, inevitably. Now, the inauguration poem, there we come to something, basically identity politics. Who can translate what? What kind of experiences do you have to carry here? Or what kind of memory community do you have to belong to in order to translate certain memory texts? That's the question now with the Biden inauguration poem. Do you need to be part of a minority in your country? Do you need to be Black? Do you need to be a descendant of slaves in order to do this? You know, I do not have a final answer here. I'm observing the discourse, and I think it's an extremely dynamic discourse. I can understand those who, in the German newspapers that I read, say, all this is epistemologically complete nonsense. What do you want? No? Do you want to grab a Black man in Germany and figure out whether genetically he goes back to a slave ship in the 16th century, and only then can he translate? I understand this, but I do also understand that it's probably now a time where these questions need to be addressed, because, and that's something that Michael Rothberg would say with the implicated subject, because it's not just a question of memory. So what do we remember about that far away past of slavery? It's a question of legacies and of ongoing relevance for present societies. If there are still colonial frameworks in our minds, if formerly enslaved people are still having a lower standard in society, then that's more than just a memory, then that's really a social fact and a legacy that needs to be addressed by remembering again. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Ο κύριος Καριώτης.
Thank you, Titika. Thank you, Professor Erll, for this wonderful talk. I'd like to bring back the discussion into literary studies, since, well, you raised some of the issues asked, but I also come from literary studies like you do, and I also teach in a literature department like you do. My question is the following. In the 60s and 70s, especially, you know, starting from Germany and then moving on to the US, there was this new theoretical proposition to go, instead of looking at the authors or the text in itself through those various formalisms, to go and pay attention to the reader, which was later known, labeled as reader response criticism. In view of a demand for a new literary history that would look into the history of the reception of works as opposed to the production of works. Well, we all know that that was a great idea, but that stayed largely on a programmatic level. You know, it never really gave actual literary histories. So my question is the following. Do you think that this newly emerged and extremely fascinating and interdisciplinary, this is very important, field we now call memory studies, and whoever is interested in comes from different backgrounds, very often from literary studies. Do you think that this new field can provide us with the conceptual framework and maybe methodological tools that can enable or give us at least some sort of hope to revisit literary history in ways that may perhaps give us a better understanding of our literary past regarding the ways that literary works were actually read and not, you know, simply produced? Because even, I'm sure that, I mean, I hope you don't, but I'm sure you do. Even in Germany, you teach literature from a traditional perspective because this is the way we go about it. We just have to go in a chronological way, have to go in a traditionally historical way. In my view, this is a very hopeful idea that we can somehow try to understand our past or literary past through the field, through this lens of, you know, which and how these works were actually read or received. So I would just like your response on that, and maybe if you know of any places, any institutions that do such work, please mention it for our students. Thank you.
So thank you for these really important and exciting questions that I've been thinking about, because the whole Homer story is, of course, also a story of receptions. Before I talk about reception, let me say one thing. The irony of memory studies is that after the death of the author and the formalism, and this is how I grew up and what I still basically say to my students, don't write about what the author wanted. Don't. It's forbidden. So after the death of the author, for memory studies, the author has returned. Sometimes it's very important who the author is. Think about the case Benjamin Wilkomirski, the fake Holocaust memoir. Suddenly, as soon as you enter these ethical fields, authorship becomes in a strange way important and interesting again. So that's the one thing. Also, what the other student just raised, questions of identity. No? What author is allowed to speak for what collectivity and their memories? Our old answer from the 60s and 70s would have been, doesn't matter at all. Everybody can write about anything. I think that's the deal of literature. And yet I think memory studies and recent ethical identity turns have complicated that. But about reception, I think, or in my mind, there are two ways of dealing with reception. And the one is reception in media, and the other is reception in mind. Easier is reception in media, because that's for me remediation. If I find that a novel is much remediated, much rewritten, adapted into television and this and that, I see that there is a strong reception. I see it through the media chains that, or cascades that develop afterwards. And this interest in reception in media is an interest that we in memory studies share with the field of classical reception studies, who of course look all the time at how Homer or whatever was went through the classical tradition, as people would have called it earlier, and they call it now classical receptions. And I think they are also not quite sure what to make of the other option, and that is reception in mind. And I think that is what the Isar school was about, the Isar, Jauss, and what they were all called, these German theorists. They were interested in reception in mind. So what are the mental images of the ideal reader that you make if you find these certain textual clues and the slots in between them? I think nowadays I would tackle this with new approaches from cognitive literary studies, who try to figure out what psychology and cognitive sciences can do for literature. Sometimes they are very heavy also on linguistics, and that's difficult for me to read and digest them, but I think it's an important field that could make something like could connect my cultural studies, questions about literature, and the broader field of memory studies, because we share some of the psychological literature. And I think on the one hand, reception in mind, if we think according to the logic of memory studies, then we need the cognitive approach. How do readers read? What do you retain? Primacy effects, recency effects, this and that, cognitive metaphor analysis, whatever. That would be cognitive literary studies. But the collective memory studies would also say, why do you remember something that has been endowed with great authority because it's canonical, because everybody said you must read it, or because it's on the syllabus? Does that change the way that you approach a certain text, or that you would forget another text? I can imagine setups where you have focus groups where people discuss, or I actually know a research project from Denmark, which is about migration literature, written by migrants from former Yugoslavia, and they read these novels in England, in Germany, in Denmark, and then they bring readers together in focus group, and they try to figure out not only what they remember, but also how they do this transcultural memory, how they imagine that different past that is not their past. So that would be the framework.
The problem is that the traditional philology is very resistant towards such approaches. And, you know, on the one hand, you have even Homer, you know, I'm mentioning it because you are dealing with it. But Homer nowadays has largely come to mean the memory of Homer and not really Homer, him or itself, you know, what was Homer. Dante, we all talk about that. Joyce, you mentioned Joyce. Who has really read Ulysses? You know, Proust, who has really read Proust? So we're talking about second and third levels of reading that really have to do with memory. Anyway, thank you very much.
I fully agree. But sometimes that's the point of the story. For example, with Homer, I mean, it is only a memory. We don't know, we haven't listened to the bards, and we don't know about first manuscripts. So it's already in the remediated stage that it comes to us. Yeah. Yeah.
Κύριε Κουρδί, θα κάνετε ερώτηση?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you for your inspiring lecture. I would like to ask you about the relation between history and collective memory. History, could we say that history is imposed cultural collective memory, or or imposes collective memory? I'm not sure about the verb. If it produces collective memory or if it is standardized collective memory.
Or the last verb I need again, or it?
Compromised, standardized.
Mm-hmm. I think the question refers to history as academic historiography, no? And its relation to collective memory. For me, still, I read the article written by Peter Berg on this issue, which came out in 1989, so quite old, but I think he really says about, and the article is called History as a Form of Social Memory. And for me, that's exactly the case. It's a form of social memory. And that's very easy to see when you look at these popular histories, the really narrative histories that also today are still written, that creates and shapes the social memory of its readership. And then there are so many connections. Historiography has as its sources collective memory. I mean, whatever one witness says, the second witness will have a different view, and they will talk about it. And what they talk about, they will probably put down in the archive or as a letter or tell to the newspaper people. And then you have the primary sources for the historians. So and if we say with Halbwachs that even very individual memories are collectively shaped, there is collective memory in historiography from beginning to end. I think what historiography gives us, or academic history, is really the methods to be very clear and very precise, to look again, knowing that it's memory, no? Not relying on one, but trying to see 3, 4, 5 different versions. That's for me really the gist of academic history as a discipline, to be able to deal with collective memory and then contribute to it again.
Thank you.
So if there is no questions, as I see, we thank you once again for being with us among us today. Thank you for your lecture, inspiring and insightful lecture. And we hope that we'll have the opportunity to welcome you in Greece sometime in the near future.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Also to all those who asked questions. Thank you.
You are very welcome.
Bye-bye.